Attention. Hull failure imminent. All personnel abandon ship. Launch in 3, 2, 1.
Subnautica is a survival and exploration game developed by Unknown Worlds Entertainment. The game begins after the player's spaceship crashes onto an alien ocean planet, leaving them stranded with limited resources and little information about their surroundings. Unlike many modern games, Subnautica does not rely heavily on objective markers, tutorial pop-ups, or long explanations to teach players how to play. Instead, players are encouraged to explore, experiment, and learn through their own experiences. When I first played Subnautica, one of the things that stood out to me was how little the game actually told me what to do. At first that seemed unusual because most games provide clear instructions and objectives from the beginning. However, the more I played, the more I realized that the game was still guiding me. It was just doing so in ways that were less obvious. In this video, I will argue that Subnautica uses environmental design, visual cues, audio messages, and indirect tutorials to guide players without relying heavily on direct instruction. These rhetorical design choices support the game's larger themes of discovery, player freedom, and fear of the unknown, while creating a rewarding sense of exploration. One of the first things players notice when they start Subnautica is the aurora. Even before players understand the game's mechanics or objectives, they can see the massive crashed spaceship sitting on the horizon. The game never explicitly tells players that the aurora is important, but its size and visibility immediately makes it stand out. This is one of the first examples of how Subnautica guides players without relying on direct instructions. When I first played the game, I remember constantly looking at the aurora, even though I did not know much about it. It naturally made me curious. As I continued playing, I realized that the game was using the environment itself to direct my attention. Instead of giving me a giant objective marker or telling me where to go, the game encouraged me to explore because I wanted to learn more about what I was seeing. This kind of guidance appears throughout the game. The safe shallows where players begin are relatively bright, open, and safe. As players become more comfortable, they naturally start exploring nearby areas like the kelp forest and the grassy plateaus. Each new area introduces different resources, creatures, and dangers. Rather than forcing progression through objectives, Subnautica encourages players to move outward because exploration is rewarding. This idea connects to Tom Van Noonen's discussion of environmental guidance in games. When discussing Journey, Van Noonen explains how visual elements within a game world can subtly direct players without them realizing it. One example he discusses is the mountain that remains visible throughout much of the game and constantly draws players forward. Van Noonen argues that environmental landmarks can quietly guide players without relying on traditional objectives or instructions. While reading this article, I immediately thought about the aurora. Even before players understood the story or mechanics of Subnautica, the crashed ship naturally draws their attention and encourages exploration. In a similar way, Subnautica uses the aurora, biome, design, lighting, and environmental landmarks to guide players through the world without constantly interrupting them with instructions. What I think makes this design choice effective is that it supports one of the game's biggest themes, discovery. Players do not feel like they are following a checklist. Instead, they feel like they are making discoveries on their own. Even though the game is guiding them, the guidance feels natural because it comes from the environment itself rather than from direct commands. This creates a stronger sense of curiosity and encourages players to keep exploring. By using environmental design as a form of guidance, Subnautica creates a balance between structure and freedom. Players are never completely lost, but they also rarely feel like they are simply following instructions. The balance is one of the reasons the game feels so rewarding to explore. While the environment does a lot of the guiding in Subnautica, it is not the only thing helping players progress. The game also uses radio messages, PDA entries, and scanning mechanics to help provide information without relying on traditional tutorials. One of the best examples of this is the radio system. Throughout the game, players receive distress calls and messages from other life pods. These messages often provide coordinates or clues that encourage exploration. What is interesting is that the game rarely forces players to follow them immediately. Instead, the messages create curiosity and give players a reason to investigate. When I first played, every time I got a new radio message, I wanted to stop what I was doing and go check it out. Not because the game was forcing me to, but because I wanted to know what I would find. Most of the time, these locations led me to new resources, blueprints, story information, or even entirely new areas of the map. Looking back, I think the radio system is one of the smartest ways the game guides players because it feels less like an objective and more like a discovery. This idea connects to Emily Johnson's discussion of tutorials in video games. Johnson argues that games can teach players through gameplay itself rather than through long explanations or instructions. Instead of stopping the player and explaining every mechanic, effective tutorials allow players to learn by interacting with the game world. Johnson argues that players often learn most effectively when information is integrated into gameplay rather than separated into long tutorial sequences. I think Subnautica does this especially well because systems like radio messages and scanning mechanics teach players while still making them feel like they are exploring on their own. Subnautica follows this approach throughout most of the game. Another example is the scanning system. Players are never handed advanced technology or recipes automatically. Instead, they have to explore, find fragments, and scan objects to unlock new equipment. The game gives players the information they need, but it requires them to actively participate in the learning process. I think this makes progression feel more rewarding because players feel like they earned their knowledge rather than simply being given it. Learning how to build a sea moth or discovering a new blueprint feels exciting because it can come from exploration and experimentation. The game is still teaching the player, but it does so in a way that feels natural. What stood out to me most while replaying parts of the game was how often Subnautica trusts the player. Many games constantly remind players what to do next or place objective markers everywhere. Subnautica gives players information, but it leaves room for them to make their own decisions. Because of that, players feel more involved in the experience and more responsible for their own progress. Another thing that stood out to me while playing Subnautica is how much the game expects players to learn through experience. Even after the opening hours, the game still does not spend much time directly explaining mechanics. Instead, players slowly learn what resources are important, which areas are dangerous, and how different systems work by actually interacting with the world. One example of this is the scanning system. Early in the game, players begin finding fragments scattered around different biomes. At first, it is not always obvious which fragments are important or what they will unlock. Over time, players start recognizing patterns and understanding what kinds of discoveries will help them progress. Eventually, things that seemed confusing at the beginning become much easier to recognize. This idea connects well with the research by Wu and Spence. Their study discusses how experience with video games can improve a player's ability to recognize important information and direct their attention more effectively. As players spend more time interacting with games, they become better at identifying patterns and focusing on information that matters. Wu and Spence found that experience with games can improve a player's ability to recognize important information and direct attention towards relevant details. This reminded me of my own experience with Subnautica, because the longer I played, the easier it became to recognize useful resources, important blueprints, and areas worth exploring. I think this idea applies directly to Subnautica. When I first started playing, almost everything felt important. I wanted to pick up every resource, scan every object, and investigate every signal. As I became more familiar with the game, I started recognizing what was actually useful and what could wait until later. The game never directly told me to develop those skills. It happened naturally through experience. What I find interesting is that this learning process makes exploration feel more rewarding. Instead of following a list of instructions, players develop their own understanding of the game world. When they successfully find a blueprint, build a vehicle, or reach a new biome, it feels like the result of their own decisions rather than something the game simply handed to them. This also connects back to one of the main themes of Subnautica, player freedom. The game gives players information, but it rarely tells them exactly how they should use it. As players become more experienced, they rely less on guidance and more on what they have learned themselves. That created a stronger sense of independence and accomplishment. By allowing players to learn through exploration and experience, Subnautica turns the learning process into part of the game. Players are not just discovering new locations and resources, they are also developing the knowledge and confidence needed to survive in an unfamiliar world. That is one of the reasons progression in Subnautica feels so satisfying compared to games that rely heavily on direct instruction. After looking at the different ways Subnautica guides players, I think the most interesting part is how the design choices support the game's larger themes. While the game is technically about survival, I think discovery, freedom, and the fear of the unknown are what make the experience memorable. One of the first things players notice is that they are alone. After the crash, there are no friendly NPCs telling players what to do, and there is no clear path to follow. Players are given a few tools and some basic information, but most of the experience is spent exploring an unfamiliar world and figuring things out for themselves. I think the environmental guidance, radio messages, and scanning systems all contribute to this feeling. The game is constantly helping players progress, but it does so in a way that allows them to feel independent. Instead of following a strict set of objectives, players feel like they are making discoveries on their own. Even when the game is guiding them, it rarely feels obvious. This is one of the reasons exploration feels so rewarding. Every new biome, blueprint, or story discovery feels earned because players had to actively seek it out. The game creates a balance between giving players enough information to move forward while still allowing them to feel like they are in control of their journey. At the same time, these same design choices also help to create fear. Because the game does not explain everything, players are often unsure what they might find next. New areas could be exciting, but they can also be intimidating. Players know there are dangers in the world, but they do not always know where those dangers are or what they look like. One of the best examples of this is the first time players encounter a Reaper Leviathan. The game does not stop and warn players before the encounter. Instead, players usually discover the creature through their own exploration. The experience is memorable because it combines discovery with uncertainty. Players are learning about the world, but they are also realizing how dangerous it can be. Looking back, I think this is why Subnautica's approach to guidance works so well. The game gives players enough direction to keep moving forward, but not so much that it removes the sense of exploration. Environmental design, indirect tutorials, and player-driven learning all work together to support the themes of discovery, freedom, and the fear of the unknown. Instead of simply telling players about these ideas, the game allows them to experience them firsthand. Those design choices are what makes Subnautica stand out from many other survival games. The game trusts players to learn, explore, and make decisions on their own. As a result, the world feels more immersive, discoveries feel more rewarding, and the overall experience becomes much more memorable. Subnautica is often described as a survival game, but after looking at its design more closely, I think what makes it memorable is the way it guides players without constantly telling them what to do. Through environmental design, visual cues, radio messages, scanning mechanics, and indirect tutorials, the game teaches players while still allowing them to feel independent. Throughout this video, I discussed how the environment itself helps direct player attention, how radio messages and PDA entries encourage exploration, and how players gradually learn through experience rather than direct instruction. These design choices help create a sense of discovery that feels natural and rewarding. I also argued that these rhetorical choices support some of the game's most important themes. By limiting direct instruction, Subnautica creates a stronger sense of freedom, while also making exploration feel more meaningful. At the same time, the lack of information contributes to the fear of the unknown that many players experience throughout the game. What stood out to me most while researching and replaying parts of the game was how much the game trusts the player. Instead of leading players through a strict sequence of objectives, it encourages them to learn, experiment, and discover things for themselves. I think that this is one of the biggest reasons Subnautica continues to be remembered as one of the most unique exploration and survival games ever made.